We are today perilously close to tipping points that, once passed, will send global temperatures spiralling catastrophically higher.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
We must show that we are capable of learning and maturing and finally taking responsibility for the destruction we are inflicting, not just upon our planet, but upon ourselves. It's time for humanity to grow up.
The nature and scale of our impact on the climate and whether and how we reduce our carbon emissions have become some of the fundamental questions of our time.
The United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade.
China has committed to move from carbon peak to carbon neutrality in a much shorter time span than what might take many developed countries.
I want to emphasize the importance of lifestyle change in climate action.
There is broad scientific consensus that the world is warming, partly due to human-caused increased CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, but there is still much disagreement about how we respond to that.
My ideal scenario is all about actually empowering markets to deliver green technologies for the future.
The faith in science and technology to deliver us into a better life, that has been dissolving. It's been crumbling for decades.
Since the discovery of several major gas fields from the 1960s, North Yorkshire has become a focal point in debates about environmentalism, development and energy production. More recently, in 2016, North Yorkshire County Council's Planning Committee granted permission for fracking to take place in Rydale. However, following years of protests, anti-fracking campaigns and reviews, plans to use the hydraulic fracturing technique, or frack, in the area was halted. I sat down with Lorraine Allison, a local holiday homeowner, former farmer and campaigner, to find out what she thinks. I asked her when she first became interested in debates about environmental issues.
It was just at the time when they said they were going to close all the pits. It went to a public inquiry, and they were a year before they gave the result of that. And that was when Michael Heseltine said they were going to close the pits, and then they straight away approved the gas-powered generating station. But what a lot of people didn't realise was there was a lot of gas wells in this area that were already drilled and that they were using. You just didn't know they existed. And they built the power station and nothing ever happened, nothing ever went wrong. And then sort of 20 odd years later, after it had been started producing, we got the issue of shale gas, which is a gas which is much deeper down under the earth than ordinary gas. It is actually the same gas, it's just called shale gas because it comes from a shale rock. And when that reared its head, somebody said to me, you do realise that the north of England is sat on the Bowland Shale and it runs right across from east to west. And I couldn't believe it because to me, I thought that's fantastic. With the pits closing, steelworks were closing, we actually had something that we could produce in the north of England that was essential. We were not going to stop using gas. You know, we use 50%, to produce electricity, we use 50% of gas to produce it, you know, so I knew it wasn't going to end. We were going to need gas for decades. So I thought, great, this would bring jobs and opportunities and investment into the north of England. So I was really passionate about that.
Tell me a bit about this area. Does it need jobs and opportunities?
It's a very rural area, but it is one of the worst areas for earning the living wage. And the main industries are agriculture and tourism. And you've got to remember that they are basically part-time, seasonal and basic paid, you know, the basic salaries paid for those. So youngsters end up moving out of this area because they cannot get a decent job. But of course, you get the environmentalists coming in and say, no, we don't want that. We don't want you to develop your area.
What's your sense of what happened in this particular area, and what do you know of what happened?
The company that was involved in producing gas for the power station wanted to try to stimulate hydraulically fracture a well as a trial. And of course the people that are opposed to hydrocarbons, they saw this as an opportunity to move into a community that was naive about what hydraulic fracturing was and to basically create terror in the local community, to terrorise people with false claims about chickens dying and cows dying and kids dying and all the rest of that sort of stuff that's just completely and utterly untrue. And of course, because people had no knowledge of that in the area, a lot of people were convinced it was a bad technology by activists who came here from London.
Well, you've got all these scare stories where they would say it contaminates water, it poisons the earth. And I started looking into what they were saying and doing a lot of research because I thought it's interesting why they're saying all these things. Why should they get away with saying all this nonsense? You know, they were saying that it would cause cancer.
Tell me about your understanding of what fracking is, first of all, and what your involvement, if any, has been in that particular industry.
After I finished my doctorate, I actually became involved in the mining industry in Australia, and then a little while later I became involved with the oil and gas industry, and that resulted in 2008 with me going to North Dakota in the USA, where I worked for 10 years on one of the world's largest unconventional oil projects, which involved hydraulic fracturing or hydraulic stimulation. If you go to communities in America where hydraulic fracturing has occurred, in North Dakota and Ohio, Pennsylvania and Texas and Louisiana, those people do not see the world in the eyes that environmental people based in big cities in London, Los Angeles and New York see the world. They're completely happy with the way that technology is used and the processes involved.
What is it, in very simple terms, for someone who has no idea what it is?
It's really about turning what historically had been a completely useless resource, which is shale rock, and being able to release enormous amounts of energy in the form of hydrocarbons, oil or gas, from useless shale, or in some places from coal. If the coal is extremely deep down in the earth, too deep to mine, it can be fractured and the gas can be released from the coal and create coal seam methane too. So it's really just a way of finding and producing energy that we never could have got at in the past.
What do you make of efforts to reduce emissions?
We can use renewables, or, well, I wouldn't call them renewables, I call them intermittent energy sources, because the wind and the solar, they are renewable in a sense, but they're intermittent in the sense that they're only here some of the time. Now, the problem that creates, whether we like it or not, whether the ideology favours that or not, is that when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, in North Yorkshire where we live, which we're coming into winter now, the sun doesn't shine a lot, and we'll get a lot of days in January and February we've got no wind. So if we're going to have renewable energy, we've also got to have a second system that provides people with power when the intermittent problem comes along. Now, that then becomes a choice. Do we use fossil fuels that we've used traditionally? Do we use nuclear power?
And what do you think about nuclear power?
Again, I think nuclear power is a perfectly sensible solution. The thing about it, though, would be if we're going to have nuclear power, then why do we need renewables?
Environmentalists would say, what about the Green Revolution or the Green New Deal, the Green Industrial Revolution? There'll be jobs and opportunities if we switch to renewables.
It's very interesting when you say that because most of the solar panels come from China. A lot of the labour is foreign. The companies that are building the wind farms offshore, a lot of it's foreign. And it reminds me of in 2010, Gordon Brown said that the Green Revolution and offshore wind would bring 70,000 jobs to the UK by 2020. Well, here we are just past there, and there's only 7,000 jobs have been created. You know, there's a lot of bull and bluster said about things and sound bites, but you know, you need to be producing things here, but how can you produce things here if energy is very expensive for manufacturing? You know, you need cheap energy, and at the moment we've got very expensive energy and it's going to get higher.
Here in Yorkshire, we have just, less than 40 miles away, we have the old coal-powered power stations at Drax Ferry Bridge. Those are now no longer using Yorkshire coal, produced here, mined here. They're using forests that are chopped down in America. They're pelletised into wood pellets, transported here on ships and burned in those power stations to produce electricity when the wind isn't blowing. when the sun isn't shining, which is a lot of the time in Yorkshire. So we need honesty in this debate. We need some real honesty, and we need to be able to pick some solutions that offer the best for people and for society.
How do we then make democratic decisions or decisions in general about these issues? Should we have a referendum? What should be done in order to include the public in this conversation?
I think a referendum, in a way, would give people a voice. And some people are against referendums because of what happened with Brexit. But actually, we are having no voice at all at the moment. And the government seem only to be listening to the loudest voices, which are like the green NGOs, who are very well funded. Ordinary people, we've got no funding, have we? You know what I mean? To get our voices heard. We can't do big advertising campaigns. You've got to have a discussion. And as we are, anybody who says the opposite of what environmentalists want to hear is closed down. You're silenced, you're targeted. You've got to allow ordinary people to have voices. And I know they did these climate assemblies, but that was very skewed because the people that came and spoke at those climate assemblies were all sort of their thinking. You didn't get the other voice heard. You know, you've got to be able to allow people to hear both sides of the story and make their own decisions.
In my PhD research, what I identified in 2002 was there's a continuum of viewpoints that I characterised as ranging from a very shallow green, where people viewed that humanity's job is stewardship over nature, to manage nature for our benefit, which would include things like ensuring the soil is healthy so we can continue to grow crops and feed people and so on. Ensure that we have clean air for people to breathe, very, very important. And then on the other end of that continuum, there was a very, very deep green, what I call an eco-extremist viewpoint, that sees humanity as a cancer upon the planet. I thought that view could never become popular, but we now have groups like Extinction Rebellion, and we have people, David Attenborough on the TV, telling us that there's too many people on the planet. It's become a mainstream viewpoint to view that humans are a problem to be eliminated.
So what do you think is at stake if we don't really pay attention to many of the questions that you're raising?
What I think you'll find is they're very anti the Industrial Revolution. That was the worst thing that's ever happened, according to them. You've got to remember that we live twice as long as the year 1900 now, because of fossil fuels, and the Industrial Revolution has helped create products. Women, it's given us freedom, because prior to being able to have fossil fuels, we would be cooking on a wood fire and having all the labour of gathering the logs and all of that. We have been given freedom, and it is parting due to fossil fuels. I don't see it ending well if they want us all to really live what their dogma is saying and what their ideology is. It's ideology, isn't it, to have us pre an industrial revolution. I think they think it'll all be wildflowers and romping over little hills with bonny little trees. It'll be a hard slog. You won't have as long a life, and you know it's miserable. It's all about constraining us, controlling us, and not allowing us our freedoms to live. We want happy lives. We don't want to live in abject misery, do we?
We're supposed to be moving away from fossil fuel powered vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, diesel and petrol cars, and yet there isn't really a plan to firstly create the electricity you would need to replace all that energy, build all the charging points. This is an enormous amount of infrastructure that you would need to support this objective, and all of that will come with a large cost that ordinary people will have to face. And it's not clear how it's going to be achieved. Climate has been seen as a matter of sort of good and evil. If you're in favour of going further, going faster, then that's positive. But if you ask any questions, that's seen as a barrier to progress. When you read the IPCC reports, they're not suggesting that we're facing such an apocalyptic scenario. But this religious imagery is being used to silence doubts, silence critics, and force everyone to get with the programme, rather than thinking carefully about the costs and benefits of the various policies that are being proposed.
What democracy actually means changes depending on the cultural context. So if you have a society of atomized individuals without strong community ties, they become very vulnerable to fear, to manipulation, to demagogues, because they don't have a strong sense of belonging and a collective meaning making. So we need to reestablish our connections, our communities, ways of taking care of each other that are not mediated by markets and technology, returning to a more local way of life. That is a prerequisite for a healthy democracy. My view of climate change is that actually greenhouse gases are a relatively minor factor compared to the destruction of the organs of a living planet. The climate change issue is inviting us into is to hold nature sacred again.
Should there be a referendum on green policies? How far should the precautionary principle go? What does a Green New Deal mean for our futures? And are there some problems too big and too imminent for democratic decision making? The answers to these questions have the potential to transform our society, and therefore how do we and who gets to decide?